We're going to be talking today about why Idahoans deserve not just sound money, but also they deserve to have their vote actually count. Got a couple of great topics that you probably need to know a little bit more about. We'll get to them next.
Press club are biased all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. One of the hardest things about living in a free society is there will always be a contingent of people who believe they know best. And if we're not careful, they who know best will find some way to impose what they know best is best for us, actually, on the rest of us. Good example of this happened just in the last month or so. Maybe you heard about this. I saw this tweet from the Idaho Freedom Foundation. Idaho Central Credit Union made headlines this past month for targeting the purchases of conservatives. And it illustrates a much deeper problem in the American banking system as a whole, and also makes the case for a brand new banking paradigm. Well, let's dive into this with the help of Niklas Kleinworth from the Idaho Freedom Foundation. He talks about how the ICCU incident makes the case for a new banking paradigm. But first, let's talk about what actually happened. Niklas tells us some of Idaho's banking institutions don't think you should be able to use your money to support things they don't believe in, even if they involve your constitutionally protected rights. Idahoans shouldn't be surprised by this. And the point here is, so long as third parties control your money, there is a risk to your financial liberty. And this is why Idahoans should consider alternatives that are free of third-party brokers, namely through technologies like Bitcoin. So here's what happened. Leaders of the Idaho Central Credit Union, or ICCU, made headlines for targeting conservatives in their newly updated terms and conditions. Now, rarely do we read the terms and conditions, right? We scroll through, yeah, I agree, whatever. Let me get to what I want to get to. Well, thankfully, someone was paying attention and noticed, hey, wait a minute, there are a few things here added to the list of things, materials that promote, intolerance, violence, or hate. Firearms and ammunition were listed as things that they don't want you spending your money on. That's sanctioned by their policies. In other words, these are things we don't want you to spend money on. They also don't want you spending them on Ponzi schemes or traveler's checks or illegal drugs or sending money overseas. Now, look, some of these you can understand. Okay, so you don't want me to support my local drug lord. Okay, that I can understand. But who gets to make the call on what's appropriate and what isn't? Especially when you talk about, firearms and ammunition. That's a protected kind of thing. Suspiciously, they also reserve the right to monitor and block your transactions, even though they simultaneously claim that they don't do either. But here's the question. Is your money in your hands or is it in theirs? So in other words, who has control of your money? Now, obviously, this generated a bit of a stir. And when Idaho Central Credit Union was called on it, well, they had some excuses. They tried to explain away the outrage as a misunderstanding of what they called standard industry verbiage. You notice this is, well, we're just doing what everybody in the industry is doing, but what if everybody else in the industry is wrong? And they updated the document to exclude those areas of concern by simply applying more broad, non-specific verbiage. But the underlying problem here is still, it's your money, or at least it's supposed to be your money. Are they really saying you shouldn't be able to use it? By the way, Niklas points out that conservatives shouldn't be surprised that the industry standard is so slanted against them. It's ridiculous for the credit union to claim that guns and ammunition inherently promote hate and intolerance, but that's the view of the left and evidently the banking industry at large. Think of any major institution that hasn't been captured by wokeness, and you'll start to understand why this is so. Niklas says if banks were private institutions, it could be argued that they should have the right not to serve industries or groups they disfavor. However, he also points out that banks are unlike normal businesses. They are so heavily regulated by the government, they are effectively extensions of the federal bureaucracy. If you don't believe this, go try to open a bank account with some kind of official identification. And since 9/11, they really like to know what's going on with your money. Why do you need that much money? Where are you sending it? What's the purpose? And so forth. They don't like cash so much either. It's a very suspicious thing. So as such, they offer federal bureaucrats many of the same powers conservatives and others rightly fear with the implementation of a central bank digital currency, barring some degree of precision in control. This is one of the reasons why you're seeing such a push, by the way, for central bank digital currencies, not just here in America, but abroad as well. It would be a marvelous mechanism of control, because if they control your money and can put conditions on, well, have you met your quota in terms of reduced your carbon footprint or so forth? If you haven't, or if you bought too much red meat or something like this, the person who controls your money has the right to say, or at least the power to say, you can't use your money for that. Your money's no good for those items. Kind of a scary thought. Nicholas says, the ICCU is far from the only example of America's financial institutions targeting conservatives. Debanking, defined as political and religious discrimination by financial institutions, is actually commonplace in the modern American financial system. Wells Fargo is under scrutiny from the Montana Attorney General for debanking industries that are inconsistent with ESG, or environmental social governance agenda. Industries in agriculture and energy, which are major economic drivers for states like Idaho and her neighbors, are also those injured by this practice. The power of banks, he says, comes through gatekeeping the financial system. Without banking services, it's impractical to participate in the modern economy, particularly as an organization or business. This is how debanking disrupts entire industries and presently strong arms adoption of the left's agenda. Now, I can think of an even more recent example, well, a couple of years ago. You remember the Canadian Freedom Convoy, the truckers that were making their way across Canada, protesting their country's absolutely abhorrent COVID lockdown policies, which it turns out were not based on science at all. What happened to those truckers? Many of them found their accounts were frozen. People who tried to donate money to them through various, give, send, go type organizations found their money confiscated and given to worthy charities. Who made that decision? Well, it was the financial institutions and those who actually have them captured, namely those in government. So that was the warning sign. And that's one of the reasons why you need to be very careful and probably at some level need to consider, is it really yours if that money isn't in your hands or at least under your direct control? So back to Nicholas's article. He says the ICCU incident illustrates a larger systemic problem. Your money is never treated as yours. Modern banking is no longer for the freedom-loving American, and overregulation thwarts any innovation that would resolve the problems faced by this now abandoned group of consumers. So what's an alternative? Well, I'm glad you asked. He says the answer to these concerns is to defend market-based alternatives to banking. Digital asset technologies like Bitcoin are shifting to a new paradigm of finance that avoids entrusting third parties, whether banks or the government, to manage those transactions. They would provide the truly free market solution that conservatives have been waiting for to combat destructive banking practices. Now, I understand there are people who, well, Bitcoin is just imaginary. It's just made up digital money itself, but it's the process that is the value. The process being an absolutely secure, permanent record of the transaction between party A and party B, without the need of a bank there to be the intermediary. And okay, we'll release the funds, and in 3 to 5 business days, it'll be in this person's account. Nope. It's instant. It's permanent. It is not falsifiable. And that is the beauty of the blockchain technology that is behind it. So, why is it that that's such a hard sell to people? Well, because for one reason, it lessens government control, and it also lessens the government's ability to do favors for its friends in the banking industry, which it turns out are pretty tight friends after all. Nicholas reminds us fundamental rights to retain and use digital assets must be part of any true free market-oriented sound money agenda. That includes the right to own and transact, to mine Bitcoin and other digital assets. Prominent politicians, other states, and Idaho's supermajority Republican Party have acknowledged the value of these rights, and they're betting on the promise of Bitcoin as one way to defend American liberties. Decentralization is the word behind this. Idaho, he says, is ripe to implement these policies at the state level during the next legislative session. Similar legislation narrowly failed in both the House and Senate during the 2024 legislative session. Now, with momentum building in the state Republican Party and at the national level, Nicholas says it's time for Idaho to finish the job. Protecting digital assets like any other property, personal property that is, provides a means for the market, not the bureaucrats, to decide how to rectify the issues we see in American banking. It's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. And I bet you will see some pretty serious opposition. These banks, not to be too obvious, but they have quite a bit of money at their disposal, which means they have a fair amount of lobbying power. One of the excuses you'll hear too is, well, criminals like to use this kind of stuff, as if they don't use dollars or cash or other means to do business. And frankly, let's talk about some of the criminal things that government accomplishes with your dollars. It's a false concern because it's coming from a place of, well, we don't have control over you and your money, and therefore, by definition, it must somehow be out of control. That's the creed of the statist. All right, shifting gears. Ranked choice voting. Let me give you a really good reason why you should not vote in favor of the open primaries, which is ranked choice or rigged choice voting that will be on the ballot this November. It poses a direct threat to your Second Amendment rights. This is an editorial from Greg Pruitt, printed in the Idaho State Journal. Greg, I believe, is the owner of the Second Amendment Foundation. Greg, I'm sorry if I got the name of that wrong, but he's Idaho's staunchest defender of the right to keep and bear arms, and he offers a very good explanation for why ranked choice voting poses a direct threat to that right. Greg says a new threat to Idaho gun rights has emerged: ranked choice voting. Now, typically, Idahoans are focused on what's happening in Washington, D.C. for threats to gun rights, right? We don't see a lot of that at the state level. Joe Biden and congressmen are constantly attacking the Second Amendment, calling for greater and greater infringements on the right to keep and bear arms. But he says, here in Idaho, we aren't usually worried about threats to gun rights coming from our own state. Well, liberals in Idaho, frustrated by their inability to turn Idaho into the next California, are launching a last-ditch effort to upend Idaho's current election system by implementing ranked choice voting, or RCV. But RCV doesn't have anything to do with gun rights, the proponents will tell you, and he says, no, directly it does not. However, indirectly, RCV 100% poses a major threat to the right to keep and bear arms, and here's how. The far-left extremists who are pushing ranked choice voting will tell you it's about fairness and turnout and other nonsense excuses for upending hundreds of years of one person, one vote types of elections. However, he says, I'm not going to get into the details and the mountain of reasons that RCV is a terrible election system, but set that all aside for a moment and focus on what the organizers are really trying to do. He says a few months ago, he spoke with one of Reclaim Idaho's volunteers at a signature collection location in Idaho Falls. Now, she didn't know who he was, but he says he asked her about the effort and what they wanted to get done. After the usual pitch that she was used to doing, she ultimately admitted it would help Democrats and it would make Idaho more moderate. In other words, more liberal. Well, what do you suppose with greater moderate or liberal control of our legislature would happen? Greg says the real objective of liberals and far-left extremists pushing ranked choice voting is to make Idaho more like California, get rid of conservative lawmakers, and allow Democrats to choose who should be a Republican nominee for elected office in Idaho. And once they've achieved those things, gun rights are on the chopping block. They'll tell you it isn't, but the reality is in places like Oregon, Washington, and California, once the liberals took over, the Second Amendment was one of their top targets. You can imagine why. They don't want you to still have the option of saying no when they tell you will do this because we know what's best. So there you have it. A couple of things to think about regarding sound money as well as protecting your right to keep and bear arms, which would very much be at threat under ranked choice voting, because ranked choice voting is all about dumbing down the system or liberalizing the system to allow people who do not take your rights seriously to gain access to power. Just a little something you should probably be thinking about when you go to the ballot in November and vote on whether or not to support ranked choice voting or open primaries. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Press Club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money.